Thunder rolls across the sky like artillery, shaking the small house to its foundations. I feel the tremble in my bones, sharp, heavy, a cruel echo from 79 years ago. Nathan glances nervously toward the window, the young man's face pale in the flickering glow of the old brass lamp beside me. "You asked about Normandy," I say softly, breaking a silence that's held between us like barbed wire. "You've heard the history, guns and glory. But there's something else. Something nobody ever talked about." Nathan's eyes dart toward mine. He's 19, same as I was that cursed morning, but untouched by the kind of horror that stains a man's soul black. He swallows hard, shifting uneasily in the faded leather chair. "What kind of something?" My chest tightens. The memories surface slowly, bitter like bile. I lean forward, reaching for the battered metal box beside my chair. The lid protests loudly when I lift it. Inside are scraps of a nightmare, yellowed photographs, dog tags clumped together, and a small black leather notebook, one I've avoided opening for decades. Nathan watches curiously as I pull out a photograph, its edges frayed with age and handling. He takes it, squinting in confusion. It's blurry, smoke curling upward, figures caught mid-motion. Dark shapes stretch and blur across the image, distorted and grotesque, more nightmare than men. "I took that picture on Omaha," I explain quietly, forcing myself not to tremble. "June 6th, 1944. My hands shook so badly I thought I'd drop the damn camera. They're blurry because I couldn't hold still, but those shapes, they're blurry because they didn't belong there." Nathan frowns. "They look like shadows." "They weren't shadows, Nate," I whisper, my throat tight. "They moved. They watched. And they took men." He looks up sharply, eyes wide, searching mine. The disbelief in his eyes fades slowly, replaced by uneasy dread. "What do you mean, took them?" I swallow hard. I didn't understand then, not fully. But beneath Omaha, the Nazis were hiding something terrible. They'd been experimenting, desperate to create weapons that could turn the war in their favor. Monsters, Nathan, real flesh and blood nightmares, worse than anything you've ever imagined. Nathan's breathing quickens. "How do you know?" "Because I was there," I say, my voice a rasp. "I watched those things tear good men apart. Nazis, Americans, they didn't care. All they wanted was blood and fear. The war woke them, and on that beach, chaos became their feast. Outside, lightning paints jagged scars across the blackened sky. Rain lashes the windows like gunfire, making Nathan jump. For a moment, I'm back there, the scent of seawater, blood, and cordite heavy in my nostrils, screams echoing in my ears. Nathan leans forward, his eyes glistening. Tell me everything. You need to understand something first, I warn, gripping the notebook tightly. Some doors, once opened, never close again. You sure you want this? He nods slowly, swallowing his fear. I want to know. A flash of lightning bathes the room in stark whiteness, illuminating the faded black and white photographs pinned to my wall. Boys who never aged, faces frozen forever at 19, 20. Boys who ran onto a shore that swallowed them whole. Boys who ran towards something infinitely worse than bullets and bombs. I flip open the notebook. The scent of mold and rot drifts upward, and memories flood me violently. June 6th, 1944, the handwriting reads, "Today is the end. We have failed to contain the experiments. They've broken through. God help whoever finds this." "What's that?" Nathan whispers, voice tight. "A German soldier's journal," I reply quietly. "Found it on the beach. It was the first clue I had that what we were fighting wasn't only German troops. They feared these things more than us. But fear wasn't enough to stop them." "What happened to the others?" Nathan asks. "Your friends?" I feel it again. The ache I've carried nearly my whole life. Most didn't survive. Some didn't even make it off the boats. And those who did, my voice catches, harsh memories clinging to my throat. They met something worse. Nathan waits, afraid to speak. I see he's gripping the arms of his chair, knuckles white. "I'll start at the beginning," I finally whisper. "But understand, Nathan, this isn't a hero's tale. It's horror, plain and true." Nathan nods, settling back uneasily. His eyes glimmer with fearful anticipation, dread lurking behind curiosity. My voice, shaking yet determined, begins to weave the memory, each word pulling me unwillingly backward through time. Back onto cold waves, engines roaring beneath my feet, salt spray stinging my eyes. Back toward a beach alive with nightmares. Outside, thunder growls softly, matching my pounding heart. Shadows dance just beyond the window glass, restless and hungry. I speak the first words that pull me fully into the past, words heavy as lead. The floor of the Higgins boat bucked violently beneath my boots, sending another hot surge of bile into my throat. Swallowing hard, I forced it down, tasting acid and diesel fumes. My stomach roiled endlessly, churned by waves, nerves, and fear. The cold spray from the English Channel splashed over the sides, soaking our uniforms, turning skin clammy and icy beneath layers of soaked wool. I glanced around, tasting coppery panic in my throat. All around me, faces were ghostly pale. Sergeant Reynolds stood rigid, gripping his Thompson tight enough to bruise his fingers, lips moving silently in prayer. Tommy Ward hunched beside me, sweat streaking his young face, eyes glazed and unfocused. He leaned forward suddenly, heaving violently into his helmet. The sharp stench made my own stomach twist again, but I swallowed hard and kept my breakfast down. Ahead, through gray mist and smoke, explosions tore into the sea. Geysers of water erupting violently, scattering fragments of metal and flesh like macabre confetti. I watched, numb as another landing craft nearby vanished beneath a fiery column of seawater, bodies tumbling lifeless into the churning ocean. My mouth went dry, heart hammering mercilessly against my ribs. Corporal Stevens leaned close, whispering frantically into my ear, "Ben, I don't want to die. Not like this. I ain't even kissed a girl yet." His voice trembled, frightened tears blending seamlessly with salt spray. "You won't," I lied, forcing conviction I didn't feel. "We'll be all right." A distant shell exploded, and suddenly fragments of shrapnel pinged against our hull, drawing terrified gasps from every man aboard. The engine roared louder, as if straining to push us through hell's own gates. The boat jerked violently again. Somewhere ahead, machine gun fire erupted, a harsh, stuttering symphony, unmistakably hungry for flesh and bone. "2 minutes," shouted the boat's pilot, barely audible over the cacophony of war. Men around me tightened grips on rifles, rosaries, and photographs. Private Daniels bent double, vomiting loudly between his boots, trembling violently. Nobody judged him. Nobody had the strength or nerve to pretend they weren't just as frightened. My stomach lurched in sympathy, forcing me to grip the railing tighter. Waves slammed harder against the hull, spraying cold salt water across our faces. Stevens stared straight ahead, eyes glazed and unfocused, lips moving silently in prayer. Beside him, Private Lewis whispered nervously to himself, his words tumbling over one another. "I don't want to die here, not today. Please, God." just not today. Ahead, the faint outline of Normandy emerged through mist and smoke, a dark smudge growing clearer, more dreadful with each passing second. Distant, shadowed bunkers loomed like gravestones along the cliffs. Artillery shells detonated around them, sparks blossoming against gray concrete, but their heavy walls seemed unmoved, indifferent to our suffering. 2 minutes, Sergeant Reynolds yelled suddenly, voice strained. I glimpsed his eyes for a brief moment. They were haunted, wide with dread, the bravado stripped away. Remember your training. When that ramp drops, move, do not stop. I forced a nod, though I wasn't sure anyone believed the words anymore. The countdown quickened my heartbeat, blood roaring in my ears louder than the artillery shells. Hands shook, rifles rattled, teeth chattered. Beside me, Tommy dry heaved again, face ghost white, hands trembling uncontrollably. God help us, someone whispered behind me. The words felt like nails driven straight into my chest. I closed my eyes tightly, pleading silently to survive whatever waited for us on that cold, distant shore. But in the pit of my stomach, a sickening certainty festered. I wasn't ready. None of us were. 30 seconds. Reynolds screamed, voice breaking in fear. Stay alive. Get off the beach, no matter what. The ramp dropped suddenly, slamming onto churning surf. My world exploded into madness. Machine gun fire tore through us instantly. Men screamed as bullets punched through flesh, bones splintered, blood sprayed warm across my face. Tommy fell forward without a sound, his helmet spinning away as his body slipped limply into the waves. The men at the front dissolved under relentless gunfire. I dove into the icy seawater, gasping in shock as my lungs seized, drowning in darkness. Beneath the surface, everything went silent. The violence above became muffled, distorted through freezing water and deafening panic. I kicked desperately upward, arms flailing, lungs bursting for air. My boots dragged me down, pulling me toward bodies drifting silently beneath the surface, pale faces frozen forever in expressions of surprise and fear. I broke the surface, choking violently, coughing seawater from my burning lungs. A bullet zipped inches past my face, slicing the air with a sickening whine. Another soldier surfaced next to me, wide-eyed and gasping, only to jerk violently as machine gun rounds punctured his chest. Red blossoms expanding rapidly across his soaked uniform. His lifeless gaze met mine briefly, a question frozen on his lips as he sank beneath the waves. I scrambled forward, half crawling, half swimming, desperate to reach land. My boots sank into soft, crimson-soaked sand. The air filled with screams, explosions, and endless, rattling gunfire. Bullets peppered the ground, kicking up sand around me. Soldiers cried for their mothers, begged God to save them, or simply wept uncontrollably, unable to move. I clawed forward desperately, hands gripping bloodied sand and tangled barbed wire. Panic surged through my veins, so raw I could taste it. I stumbled behind a twisted tank trap, lungs rasping painfully. My helmet fell forward, blinding me briefly. Pulling it back, I blinked wildly through blood and tears. Omaha Beach stretched ahead, a twisted landscape painted in smoke, blood, and death. Corpses littered the ground, limbs severed, faces frozen in terror. Soldiers crawled forward, bleeding, choking on sand. Behind me, landing crafts burned fiercely, throwing black smoke skyward. I raised my head cautiously, peering toward the enemy bunkers. Gun barrels flashed relentlessly, hurling death upon us. But as explosions lit the German defenses, my heart froze in my chest. Beyond the enemy guns, partially hidden beneath dark concrete fortifications, were tunnels, dark, unnatural openings in the earth. The Germans fired their guns furiously, yet strangely, they kept glancing back over their shoulders. Even from this distance, I could see their faces twisted not just by rage, but terror. Those dark tunnels, yawning wide beneath Nazi positions, drew my gaze like open wounds. Something inside them whispered silently, pulling me, beckoning with obscene promise. I stared, hypnotized, fear crawling through my skin. "Carter," Reynolds shouted beside me, grabbing my shoulder violently, snapping me from the trance. "Get your head down." I obeyed, heart hammering wildly. Reynolds pulled me closer, voice trembling, eyes wild. "Something ain't right, Ben," he gasped. "Germans look more afraid than we are." He stared toward the bunkers, eyes wide and haunted. The ground beneath us trembled with distant explosions, artillery slamming into earth like fists. I felt Reynolds' grip tighten on my shoulder, fingers digging into flesh. "Whatever's up there," he said, voice barely a whisper, "it's worse than bullets. God help us all." I stared at him, tasting blood, salt, and fear. Ahead, Omaha Beach waited, eager to swallow us whole. Bullets tore relentlessly into the sand, kicking up geysers of blood-soaked earth all around me. My heart pounded wildly, adrenaline surging through veins stretched tight with panic. All around, the beach was littered with dead and dying soldiers, bodies contorted in grotesque poses, men sobbing through agony, begging desperately for mothers who would never hold them again. I scrambled forward through smoke and tangled wire, keeping low, crawling desperately toward the slight protection of shattered steel hedgehogs. The noise was overwhelming, gunfire ripping the air apart, artillery shells detonating, men screaming as shrapnel sliced through flesh and bone. To my left, Corporal Stevens suddenly stood upright, as if confused, clutching his rifle loosely. His mouth opened, his face slack, eyes wide as though trying to ask a question, but no words came. A moment later, his body twisted violently backward as bullets tore through his chest. Blood sprayed a dark arc against the gray sky. He collapsed soundlessly, eyes still confused, staring into eternity. "Keep moving," Reynolds shouted hoarsely, his voice raw and desperate. He shoved me forward, past Stephen's corpse, toward a tangled mess of barbed wire and twisted metal barriers just ahead. Around me, chaos reigned, soldiers falling, limbs shredded by explosions. Private Daniel stumbled by, clutching the mangled remains of his right arm, blood streaming between trembling fingers, his mouth open in a silent, endless scream. I dove into a shallow crater, landing roughly on something soft and warm. Glancing down, I realized with sickening horror it was the mutilated corpse of another soldier. His face was barely recognizable, a hole gaping where his jaw had been. My stomach convulsed violently, bile surging hotly into my throat. But there was nothing left to bring up. "Get your head down," Reynolds screamed again, pulling me roughly forward. Bullets whined past us, splitting air inches away, tugging violently at our clothing. Just ahead, a row of German trenches lay exposed, shattered by artillery impacts, spewing smoke and debris skyward. Yet something felt wrong. Ahead, a machine gun nest suddenly erupted in a strange frenzy of fire. Bullets spraying wildly in all directions, up, down, sideways, as if the German soldiers manning it had lost their minds. Shouts of fear reached my ears, screams in frantic German punctuated by bursts of erratic gunfire. "What the hell's wrong with them?" Reynolds gasped, noticing it too. His voice was barely audible over explosions, but I saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. I shook my head, coughing on smoke. "They're panicking," I yelled back. "Something behind them. Something's gone wrong." "Move," Reynolds barked, pulling us forward again. We rushed across open sand, bullets ripping past, the ground shuddering violently beneath our boots. Men fell on either side, faces twisted in shock, agony, terror. A young soldier dropped at my feet, reaching upward, begging silently, eyes wide and pleading. I hesitated, hands trembling uselessly, until Reynolds grabbed my arm again and jerked me forward. I could barely hear my own voice screaming in protest above the chaos. Finally, we stumbled into the shallow remains of a trench line littered with twisted metal, smoldering craters, and dead men. I collapsed beside Reynolds, gasping, lungs burning, head spinning wildly. Other survivors joined us, collapsing around us, sobbing, retching, and shaking uncontrollably. As my vision cleared, nausea surged once more. The trench wasn't just filled with dead Germans. It was filled with something far worse. Bodies were twisted impossibly, limbs torn cleanly away, entrails spilling like grotesque vines from ruptured torsos. The smell was thick, nauseating, a coppery sweetness mingled with burned flesh. These men hadn't died by bullets or artillery. They'd been ripped apart, savaged brutally by something inhumanly strong. Jesus Christ, someone whispered, crossing himself feverishly. My breath caught painfully in my chest. Reynolds knelt beside a corpse, shaking visibly as he reached to touch deep gouges clawed into the German soldier's uniform. The wounds were huge, ragged, the edges blackened as though burned. "Ben," Reynolds whispered, his voice raw and shaking. "This ain't right." I looked around wildly. Soldiers, my own squad mates, lay huddled around me, eyes wide, trembling, unable to process the nightmare surrounding us. Whatever had torn these Germans apart was gone, vanished like a ghost, leaving only carnage behind. Gunfire continued to tear into the earth. But now we heard more clearly the frantic German voices from the concrete bunkers ahead. They screamed in blind panic, firing sporadically into their own trenches, shouting warnings we couldn't understand. But their terror needed no translation. My heart pounded violently, a sickening realization growing colder with each passing second. We hadn't escaped the horror. We'd simply entered deeper into it. Private Lewis crawled closer, shaking, eyes darting fearfully from corpse to corpse. "Sarge," he whispered desperately, "what did this? What's happening?" Reynolds stared bleakly into Lewis's terrified eyes, unable to answer. The question hung unanswered, lingering, poisonous in the air. I glanced toward the looming bunkers rising from the smoke-shrouded cliffs ahead. They stood starkly silhouetted against the storm-clouded sky. Concrete giants towering over the blood-drenched sands below. Dark openings beneath the bunkers glared back at me. Tunnels stretching downward into blackness, as if inviting us inward. A deep dread crawled through my chest, paralyzing my breath. I knew with sickening certainty that whatever had savaged these trenches lurked within those tunnels. It waited patiently, hungrily, hidden beneath concrete and earth, watching us even now. Reynolds caught my gaze, his expression haunted, recognizing the fear reflected in my eyes. He gave me a grim nod, silent acknowledgement of the horrors yet to come. I tightened my grip on my rifle, hands slick with blood and sweat, pulse hammering in my ears. Bullets and explosions still raged around us, death screaming endlessly from every direction. But the greatest terror lay ahead. Not German soldiers, not machine guns or artillery, but something deeper, older, and infinitely worse. Something beneath the sand, and somehow we were going to have to face it. My heart hammered violently against my rib cage as Reynolds led us through smoke-choked trenches toward the nearest German bunker. Each step sank into sand drenched with blood, grit sticking to our boots, making every footfall heavy and reluctant. My mouth tasted bitter, a vile mixture of gunpowder, seawater, and fear. The concrete structure loomed like a grim tombstone above us, pocked with bullet holes, its wide-open steel door hanging ajar. Sergeant Reynolds glanced back, sweat streaking pale skin darkened by soot and dried blood. Eyes sharp, he whispered harshly, voice frayed and tense. Guns up, expect anything. We stepped inside cautiously, weapons trembling in exhausted hands. I moved alongside Lewis and Daniels, their ragged breathing matching my own. Behind us, echoes of battle sounded muffled, muted reminders of a world we'd just abandoned. The air inside was stifling and thick, sour with smoke, blood, and something else, a raw metallic tang, something sinister and unfamiliar. We froze as Reynolds' flashlight beam swept across blood-smeared walls. Crimson handprints stretched in desperate smears toward the doorway we'd entered through, as if someone had fought tooth and nail to escape. The beam caught something written hastily in thick red letters. frantic German script scrawled like an omen. Die Verlorenen sind frei. Daniel shifted uneasily, breath hitching. What's that mean, Sarge? Reynolds stared grimly at the writing. The lost ones are free, he murmured. The color drained from his face, eyes wide and haunted. But who the hell are the lost ones? Nobody answered. We pressed forward, boots crunching over shattered concrete and broken glass. Uniforms lay scattered like discarded skins, torn and bloody. Scattered around the corridor like morbid confetti. Some still contained body parts, severed limbs, twisted unnaturally. Nausea rose thickly in my throat again, but I forced myself onward, breathing shallow through my teeth. Further in, darkness swallowed us, illuminated only by Reynolds' flickering flashlight beam. The deeper we moved, the thicker the air became, stale and coppery with blood and rot. I tripped suddenly, catching myself on something cold, slimy. I lifted my hand to find it coated with dark blood, glistening in the dim half-light. Ahead, Lewis retched, turning aside to vomit violently against the wall. Christ, what happened here? He gasped, shaking uncontrollably. No answer came. No one had an explanation. We moved slowly, silently, descending concrete stairs, slick with gore. The staircase opened into a large chamber, dimly lit by flickering emergency lamps. Reynolds hesitated at the entrance, muttering a curse beneath his breath. God Almighty, he whispered. The chamber was a makeshift laboratory, a crude assembly of tables and machinery, shattered and upturned. Broken glass containers lay everywhere, dark liquid pooling across the floor. I stepped carefully around twisted metal tables, breath catching painfully in my throat. Bodies lay sprawled across the ground, wearing bloodied white lab coats. Their eyes stared blindly toward the ceiling, frozen in eternal terror. One scientist lay partially dissected atop a table, his chest pried open, ribs spread grotesquely like grisly wings. Something had devoured parts of him, flesh ripped away brutally. Lewis gagged again, staggering away, face ghostly pale. Reynolds clenched his teeth, searching the scene grimly. The Germans unleashed something here, he whispered bitterly. And whatever it was, it turned on them. The distant rumble of artillery reminded me this nightmare existed within another. The war raged on outside, But we'd slipped beyond that battle into something older, darker, something that made bullets feel trivial, meaningless. A sound echoed suddenly, dragging us all rigid with fear. A low, ragged breathing, like a wounded animal panting painfully in the shadows ahead. I swung my rifle toward the darkness at the far end of the chamber. Reynolds motioned silently, signaling us forward cautiously. Eyes wide, heart pounding in my ears like a relentless drum. A shadow shifted in the corner, massive, twitching grotesquely. Daniel stepped closer, trembling hands clutching his rifle. Before anyone could react, the shape lunged impossibly fast, snarling as it emerged from darkness. A creature taller than any man, with pale skin stretched tightly over distorted, rippling muscle leaped into view. Multiple eyes stared wildly from its misshapen head, yellowed teeth jutting savagely from raw, torn lips. Its flesh, translucent and veined, quivered as if constantly writhing in pain. The thing moved with unnatural jerks, fingers ending in jagged, blood-soaked claws. It grabbed Daniels before he could scream, shredding him violently, ripping flesh apart as though paper. Blood sprayed hotly across my face. Lewis screamed, stumbling backward in terror, firing wildly. The bullets sank into the creature's flesh, barely slowing it. It turned, roaring in agony and fury. "Kill it!" Reynolds screamed desperately, emptying his Thompson into the beast. Bullets hammered the creature, flesh rupturing violently beneath each impact. Black fluid spraying outward, but still it charged, undeterred. Mouth stretched open in a grotesque howl. Lewis stumbled backward, tripping over Daniel's mutilated remains. Before Lewis could rise, the creature's claws raked violently through his torso, opening him in a savage, sweeping motion. Lewis stared downward, disbelief filling his eyes, his body collapsing limply onto blood-soaked concrete. I screamed wordlessly, unloading my rifle until my hands blistered from recoil, each round tearing deeper into monstrous flesh. Other soldiers joined, firing wildly, desperately. The creature jerked, stumbled, finally collapsing forward with a wet, sickening sound, flesh and bone finally surrendering beneath relentless gunfire. Silence filled the chamber, punctuated only by gasping breath and shell-shocked sobs. Reynolds staggered forward, eyes wide, staring blankly at the monstrous body lying before us. "This is what they created," he murmured hoarsely, words shaking uncontrollably. This is what they lost control of. I approached slowly, rifle trembling, eyes locked in horrified fascination. Beneath shredded skin, dark veins pulsed grotesquely. Its face, distorted, inhuman, yet undeniably once human, stared upward blindly, frozen in agony. This was a man, I whispered in disbelief, stomach twisting violently. They did this to a man. Reynolds turned, gripping my arm tightly, eyes wide with realization. "And there's more," he said, voice cracking with dread. The Germans weren't just afraid, they were terrified. They didn't just create monsters, they set them loose. I felt my blood run cold, my heart freezing inside my chest. The German warning echoed in my mind. Die Verlorenen sind frei. The lost ones were free. Beneath my feet, deeper within tunnels stretching downward into darkness, something moved. Something stirred awake, hungry and waiting. We'd opened Pandora's box, and there was no way to close it again. Gunfire exploded around us, deafening in the confined space, as more monstrous shadows surged from the darkness. They charged with savage fury, pale skin glistening grotesquely under flickering lights, their twisted forms writhing with unnatural strength. Flesh ripped apart beneath claws, bones snapped with sickening ease, and human screams echoed endlessly through concrete corridors slick with blood and gore. I stumbled backward, firing blindly, empty shell casings clattering across bloody tiles. Beside me, Reynolds shouted orders lost amid screams and gunfire, his voice cracking in panicked desperation. Another soldier fell shrieking, his chest torn open in a spray of crimson mist. The creature that killed him roared, a tortured sound born of agony rather than triumph, its multiple eyes wide with unending pain. "Fall back," Reynolds shouted hoarsely, firing his Thompson until it clicked dry. "Ben, move." We fled deeper into the bunker, heartbeats echoing in my skull, fear drowning rational thought. We turned another corner, plunging through an iron door barely hanging on rusted hinges. Reynolds slammed it shut, barring it quickly with a twisted metal pipe. Immediately, something slammed violently into the other side, bending steel and concrete with its rage-filled strength. "This won't hold long," Reynolds gasped, eyes wild with panic. I spun, searching desperately. A narrow hallway stretched deeper into darkness, illuminated sporadically by dim, flickering bulbs overhead. To my right, Lewis's blood-soaked dog tags burned hotly against my palm, his final terrified expression carved forever in my memory. Nausea surged again, forcing me onward, stumbling numbly forward, following the faint glow from a distant doorway. At the hall's end, a partially opened steel door beckoned ominously, its surface smeared darkly with bloodied handprints. Something about its secrecy compelled me forward. Reynolds moved beside me, breathing raggedly, weapon trembling violently in shaking hands. "God forgive us," he whispered, fear twisting his face. "Whatever they've done here, we have to end it." I pushed cautiously through the door, stepping into a small room filled with blinking controls, scattered papers, and strange equipment humming softly. A control room, hidden, untouched, still warm with frantic German activity from mere hours before. Desperation lingered here, invisible but palpable in the hastily abandoned chairs, spilled coffee cups, half-smoked cigarettes still smoldering in overflowing ashtrays. Reynolds watched the hallway nervously, gripping his rifle tight. "Quick, Ben, figure this out. Whatever they did here, we gotta stop it." I moved shakily toward a desk cluttered with papers and notebooks, heart hammering violently. My trembling fingers grabbed a leather-bound journal. Dark stains smudged its pages. Flipping through the pages revealed frantic, hastily scribbled German entries, sketches of human anatomy distorted grotesquely, intricate symbols I couldn't recognize. The words were hurried, increasingly desperate, filled with madness and horror. My stomach twisted painfully as I read a colon. May 27th, 1944. The experiments progress poorly. Subjects experience severe mutations, aggression uncontrollable, pain intolerable. Failures must be contained. June 3rd, 1944. We cannot control die Verlorenen. Their strength surpasses our expectations, but their minds shatter immediately. The Führer demands we continue. These creatures may yet save the Reich if they do not destroy us first. June 5th, 1944. Containment breach in Sector 4. Lost ones rampaging, tearing apart anyone in sight. Communications failing. We can no longer contain them. God forgive us. They are free. Reynolds moved anxiously. Ben, talk to me. What did you find? They lost control, I whispered, my voice barely audible. They created them, super soldiers born of genetic horror and occult sciences. They tortured men, twisted them into monsters, but the pain, the agony drove them insane. They're just mindless rage now. The Nazis lost containment hours ago. My heart clenched painfully, realization dawning cruelly. I stared at the control panel, blinking lights beckoning urgently, warning alarms flashing silently in patterns I couldn't fully understand. Reynolds' face paled further. So they're loose now. We can't let 'em get out, Ben. They'll slaughter everything. I nodded numbly, gripping the journal tightly. There's a failsafe, explosives rigged to collapse everything below. They knew it might end like this, but we have to trigger it manually. A scream echoed distantly, drawing nearer. Gunfire erupted again, accompanied by savage roars of creatures stalking us relentlessly. Reynolds turned sharply toward the door, panic rising. Then trigger it, Ben. Do whatever you have to. I hesitated, throat dry, heart thudding painfully. We're still down here. Reynolds' eyes locked with mine. Understanding, dread, and resignation flickered simultaneously. If we don't do it now, they'll get out. They'll get to our boys up top, maybe beyond. There ain't no choice left, Carter. I stared at the control panel again, breathing shallow, pulse deafening in my ears. One switch gleamed red, final, terrible, absolute. My hand trembled, fingertips brushing cold metal. God forgive me, I whispered softly. An unholy shriek split the silence. The hallway door slammed open violently, the barricade shredded. A monstrous shape lunged through, eyes blazing with madness, its twisted body drenched in fresh blood. Do it, Ben, Reynolds roared, firing wildly into the creature. Bullets tore flesh, spraying dark fluid across flickering walls. The beast staggered, roaring louder, charging again through relentless gunfire. I slammed the switch down, lights flashing violently. Alarms erupted loudly through the complex, a shrill countdown beginning rapidly. Reynolds stumbled backward under the creature's onslaught, screaming defiantly, emptying his rifle point blank into monstrous flesh. The creature collapsed atop him, both bodies tumbling violently to the floor, tangled in bloody ruin. Run, Reynolds shouted weakly, his eyes wide, pleading. For God's sake, Ben, run. I sprinted desperately back toward the stairs, alarms deafening, red lights strobing madly across blood-slicked walls. Other creatures howled from deeper below, sensing doom approaching, their rage rising into shrieks of tortured agony. My boots pounded concrete steps, adrenaline blinding me to everything but survival. The tunnels shook violently, cracks racing upward along concrete walls. Fire and smoke filled the air as explosions erupted beneath, the bunker screaming in agony, walls splitting apart around me. I burst outside into blinding daylight, collapsing to my knees on blood-stained sand, gasping, choking. Behind me, the bunker imploded violently, earth collapsing inward, swallowing tunnels, labs, monsters, and men beneath mountains of rubble and smoke. For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy and absolute, punctuated only by distant artillery thuds. I lay trembling, tasting blood and ash, the knowledge of horrors buried now beneath tons of stone. But inside my soul, dread clawed deep. Beneath the earth, buried but not destroyed, evil stirred restlessly. The lost ones were silent now, but nightmares never truly slept. My voice fades slowly into silence, the final words settling heavily upon Nathan. Outside, the storm still pounds mercilessly at the windows, the thunder murmuring like distant artillery, rain running down the glass like the blood of long-dead men trickling into sand. Nathan sits motionless, his face pale, knuckles whitened by the tightness of his grip on the faded photograph. His breathing is shallow, eyes glassy, focused on something beyond the room. I know that look. It mirrors the emptiness I felt coming home from Normandy nearly 80 years ago. "You never told anyone?" he asks finally, voice trembling with disbelief, eyes glistening. "Who would have believed me?" I whisper bitterly. They gave me medals, shook my hand, thanked me for my service, but none of that mattered. They called me a hero, Nathan, but the truth is, heroes don't walk away from beaches covered in blood. Only ghosts come back from that place. He nods slowly, shifting in his chair, eyes flickering uncertainly toward the storm-lashed window. Thunder growls softly again, shadows dancing wildly as lightning flashes beyond the trees. The wind wails softly, almost human in its mournful tones. "What happened after?" Nathan asks quietly, leaning forward. "The creatures beneath the sand, were they really gone?" I stare down at my trembling hands, feeling the weight of memories pressing cold and merciless against my chest. Gone, but never destroyed, hidden beneath tons of concrete and sand, buried deep, but always there, always restless, always hungry. Nathan swallows hard, glancing toward the darkness outside, visibly unsettled. But could they still be down there, waiting? I meet his gaze steadily, knowing my answer would carve itself deeply into his nightmares. They're down there, Nathan. Evil like that doesn't die easily. It waits patiently, feeding on chaos, pain, fear. War awakens them. And humans, I whisper bitterly, feeling the truth in my bones, humans never truly stop waging war. The storm outside swells suddenly, wind shrieking angrily against the windows, rattling the house. Lightning flashes brightly again, casting twisted, shifting shadows across the trees. Shadows too long, too dark, moving in ways shadows shouldn't move. Nathan's breath catches sharply, his body rigid with sudden dread. "Did you see that?" he whispers. I stare silently into the night, heart pounding, knowing exactly what he sees, what I've always known. My throat tightens painfully, the scars of Omaha Beach aching anew. "They never left," I whisper hoarsely, my voice barely audible over the storm. "They've been waiting, Nathan. Beneath the ground, beneath our feet, beneath every battlefield we create." Nathan swallows hard, gripping the photograph until it trembles between his fingers. His voice is a ghostly whisper. "Waiting for what?" I lean forward slowly, eyes locked upon his, the room darkening as lightning fades, shadows lengthening, creeping closer through the window pane. "War awakens them, Nathan," I murmur softly. "And humans never truly stop waging war."